In the heart of an old kingdom, beyond forests dark as ink and hills forever wrapped in mist, there stood a castle of black stone. Its towers rose into the grey sky like broken fingers, and its walls had watched generations of kings come and go. But among all the rulers whose names had been carved into the royal crypt below, none would be remembered with such unease as King Aldrin. He was not yet an old man when the fear began. In those days, he was still spoken of as strong, clever, and chosen by fate itself. The people bowed when he passed. The court praised his judgment. The priests blessed his reign. And yet, behind the gold, the velvet, and the cold dignity of the crown, something restless already lived within him. On the first night of winter, after a feast held in honor of his 10th year upon the throne, the king walked alone through the western wing of the castle. Servants had long abandoned that part of the palace after sunset. The corridors were too quiet there, and the old walls seemed to breathe with the weight of forgotten years. Only the trembling light of his candle moved beside him. At the end of the passage stood a chamber sealed for decades, the Mirror Hall. No music was heard there, no laughter, no prayer, only silence. And as King Aldrin placed his hand upon the iron handle and slowly opened the door, he stepped into the room where his life would begin to change forever. The hall was larger than he remembered from childhood. Tall mirrors lined the walls from floor to ceiling, framed in silver darkened by age. Candlelight trembled across their surfaces like pale ghosts trapped beneath glass. Dust hung in the air, and every step of the king echoed longer than it should have, as if the chamber were listening. Aldrin moved deeper into the room, his face stern, though his breath had grown slow and shallow. Before him stood the tallest mirror of all, older than the kingdom's newest chapel, older perhaps than the dynasty itself. Its surface was unnaturally clear, too clear. It reflected not only the shape of the king, but every shadow beneath his eyes, every line at the corner of his mouth, every hidden weariness he never allowed the court to see. For a long moment, nothing was wrong. Then he noticed it. His reflection was still looking at him, but not quite as he stood. The king's face remained cold and motionless, yet in the mirror there seemed to flicker the faintest trace of a smile. Not warmth, not amusement, something quieter, colder, as though the man in the glass knew a secret too terrible to speak aloud. Aldrin stepped back at once. The smile vanished. The mirror became ordinary again. He told himself it was the candlelight, fatigue, too much wine at the feast, too many sleepless nights. But as he turned away, he could not resist one final glance. And for the briefest moment, he saw the figure in the mirror still facing forward, even though he himself had already begun to turn. That night, sleep would not come. The king lay awake in his vast chamber, while moonlight spilled through narrow windows and painted pale bars across the floor. The fire in the hearth had burned low. The servants had withdrawn. Even the guards outside his doors seemed impossibly distant, as though the castle itself had stepped away from him. Near the far wall stood a polished mirror of Venetian glass, half covered now with a heavy cloth he had ordered thrown over it without explanation. But still he could feel it there. Again and again, Aldrin closed his eyes and saw the face from the hall. His own face, and yet not his own. It had not looked monstrous. That was what disturbed him most. It had looked human, familiar, only stripped of all disguise, like a version of himself that no throne, no prayer, and no royal command could control. Near midnight, he rose from his bed and crossed the chamber in silence. His bare feet touched the cold stone floor. His hand trembled only once before it reached for the cloth. He did not know what answer he expected, only that some terrible need pulled him forward. With one sharp movement, he tore the cover away. The mirror showed only the king, pale, tired, crowned by shadows. But his eyes were wide now, and something in them had changed. For the first time in many years, King Aldrin looked not like a ruler of men, but like a man who had seen the edge of something waiting in the dark. And before dawn broke over the castle, he gave the first order born of fear. Every mirror in the palace was to be covered before sunrise. By sunrise, the king's command had spread through every corridor of the palace. Servants moved in silence, carrying heavy dark cloth from chamber to chamber. Mirrors in guest rooms, polished shields in the guard hall, silver trays in the kitchens, even small hand mirrors belonging to noblewomen of the court. All were hidden, removed, or turned to the wall. No one dared question the order aloud, though the castle breathed with whispering fear. In a royal household, strange habits could be tolerated, but fear in a king was something else. Fear had a way of traveling faster than plague. Aldrin did not appear at the morning meal. He remained in his private chamber, listening to footsteps pass beyond the door, hearing the rustle of fabric as one reflective surface after another vanished beneath black coverings. The knowledge should have comforted him. Instead, it made the palace feel like a tomb preparing itself for burial. At noon, his steward entered to report that the command had been obeyed. Every visible mirror in the western and southern wings had been covered. The king asked only one question. Did any of them show anything? The steward hesitated. He was an old servant, careful with every word. No, Your Majesty. Aldrin studied his face for signs of a lie, then dismissed him with a sharp motion of the hand. But when the door closed, the king's certainty did not return. It was not the answer that disturbed him. It was the hesitation before it. For the rest of the day, he avoided the windows, where rainwater gathered in the leaded glass. He turned away from polished goblets. He refused his armor when the captain of the guard requested his appearance in the training yard. By evening, rumors had already reached the kitchens. The king had seen an omen. The king had been cursed. The king had looked upon a demon wearing his face. And alone in the deepening dark, Aldrin began to wonder whether rumor had come closer to truth than any man in the castle could imagine. 3 days later, determined to prove himself master of his own mind, the king summoned the royal painter. Master Edric had served the court for over 20 years. He had painted coronations, treaties, births, and funerals. His portraits were known for their honesty, though in royal courts, honesty was often dressed in flattery. If anyone could place the king's face before him without the treachery of glass or polished silver, it would be Edric. The painter arrived with his boards, pigments, brushes, and solemn obedience. He was led to a warm chamber, lit by high windows and rows of candles. There, Aldrin took his seat upon a carved chair beneath the banner of his house, hands resting on the arms like stone. He wore his crown, though it felt heavier than iron that day. "Paint me as I am," the king said. Edric bowed his head. "As your majesty commands." For hours the room remained still, except for the soft scratch of brush against prepared panel. The painter worked carefully, glancing up, then down again, building the king's image in layers of shadow and pale flesh. At first, Aldrin found a strange comfort in the process. A portrait could not move. A portrait could not smile on its own. Paint obeyed the hand of the living. But as the afternoon deepened, unease returned. There was something wrong with the image forming on the board. The face was his, yes. The same brow, the same mouth, the same dark eyes. Yet the expression that emerged was not the expression he wore. The painted king looked harder, colder, not merely weary, but watchful, as if judging everyone who stood before him. There was cruelty gathering in the corners of the mouth, and a terrible intelligence in the gaze, like a man who had learned to hide pleasure behind silence. Aldrin rose so abruptly that the chair scraped against the floor. Edric startled, nearly dropping his brush. "What is that?" the king demanded. "Your Majesty's portrait," said the painter, though his voice had lost its color. The king seized the panel and stared at it. No demon, no monster, only himself, and yet not the face he believed he had shown the world. For one long moment, neither man spoke. Then Aldrin thrust the portrait into the fire. The dry wood cracked, the oils hissed, and the painted eyes blackened in the flames. Edric fell to his knees in shock, but the king did not apologize. He stood watching until the face was ash. That evening, the servants whispered of another order. No portrait of the king was to be painted again without his direct command. The first true panic came during the winter feast of St. Severin. The great hall blazed with torchlight. Musicians played beneath the rafters. Steam rose from platters of roasted meat, and red wine flowed as freely as gossip. Lords from the northern lands had come to swear loyalty, and Aldrin could not refuse the ceremony without inviting suspicion. So he entered the hall dressed in velvet and fur, every inch a sovereign, though dread moved inside him like a second heartbeat. For a time, he endured. He spoke the expected words. He raised his cup when the nobles toasted his health. He even forced a thin smile when laughter passed around the tables. Yet all the while he avoided looking too closely at anything that might shine. Goblets, knives, polished serving dishes, each seemed to him a hidden doorway waiting to open. Then it happened. As a servant refilled his silver cup, the king glanced downward and saw, for a split second, his reflection in the dark red wine. The face staring back was pale as wax. Its eyes were sunken deeper than his own, ringed in shadow. Its lips were parted slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition, as if it had been waiting beneath the surface for him to look. And then, before Aldrin could breathe, the reflected mouth began to move. No sound rose from the cup. No one else noticed anything at all, but the king saw those lips shape something like a word. He recoiled violently. The goblet flew from his hand and struck the stone floor with a sharp metallic cry. Wine spread across the rushes like blood. The musicians stopped. Conversation died at once. Every noble in the hall turned toward the dais. Aldrin stood rigid, chest heaving, staring at the spilled drink as though something might crawl out of it. "Remove it," he said, but his voice barely rose above a whisper. No one moved. Then louder, harsher, with sudden fury, "Remove it!" Servants rushed forward, kneeling to clean the mess. Some crossed themselves, others kept their eyes lowered, unwilling to witness the king's disgrace. Aldrin looked over the hall and saw not loyalty, but fear. Not of a ruler, but of a man unraveling before them. He left the feast before the final prayer was spoken, and by midnight, the story had spread beyond the castle kitchens, beyond the walls, into the sleeping town below. The king had seen something in his cup that no man was meant to see. That same night, long after the feast had ended in silence and shame, King Aldrin sent for Father Oswin, the oldest priest still serving within the castle walls. The chapel where they met was small and cold, hidden behind a narrow passage of worn stone. Its candles burned low, bending in the draught like fragile souls unwilling to leave the world. Colored saints stared down from the stained glass windows, their faces broken by moonlight. Before the altar, the king stood without his crown, cloaked in black, looking less like a ruler and more like a man called to answer for something he had spent years trying not to name. Father Oswin arrived slowly, leaning on an oaken staff, polished by age and prayer. He had baptized princes, buried queens, and heard confessions that would have shattered weaker men. Yet even he paused when he looked upon Aldrin's face. "You have seen it again," the priest said quietly. The king did not ask how he knew. "In the hall first," Aldrin murmured, "then in my chamber, tonight in the wine." He turned toward the altar, jaw tight. "It is my own face, Father, but it does not obey me. It watches. It waits." Oswin's grip tightened on the staff. "There are times," he said, "when a man is followed not by spirits, but by truth." Aldrin gave a bitter laugh. "Truth does not smile at me from glass." "No," said the priest, "but guilt may." The words settled between them like a blade. The king's expression hardened at once, though something deeper flickered beneath it. "Speak plainly." Oswin hesitated. "There are old teachings, older than this chapel, older than your father's reign. They say that certain objects remember what men try to hide. Mirrors, water, polished metal. They do not merely return the face. Under certain burdens, they return something else." The candles hissed softly. "And what burden is mine?" Aldrin asked. But the priest did not answer. Not fully. Instead, he lowered his head and whispered, "Some reflections are not sent to frighten us, Your Majesty. They are sent so we cannot continue pretending." For the first time since winter began, the king felt a colder fear than terror itself. Not fear of what followed him, fear that it might belong to him. The next morning, before dawn had fully broken over the frozen hills, Father Oswin led the king beyond the royal apartments and down into the oldest part of the castle. The foundations laid long before Aldrin's bloodline had taken the throne. They passed through unused corridors, spiral stairs slick with damp, and doorways so low even the priest had to bow his head. The deeper they descended, the more the air changed. It grew still and mineral, touched by the scent of dust, wax, and ancient stone. At last they reached a forgotten chamber beneath the chapel itself, a place few living men knew existed. It had once served as a vault for sacred relics. Shelves lined the walls, heavy with cracked manuscripts, sealed boxes, and objects hidden from ordinary prayer. A single lantern cast weak gold over the room, revealing carvings cut into the stones, circles, crosses, and symbols worn nearly smooth by time. At the center stood a chest bound in iron. Father Oswin stopped before it and spoke as though even the room might be listening. "There was a mirror once," he said, "brought to this land by men who returned from the eastern roads. They claimed it had belonged to a noble house destroyed by betrayal, madness, and murder. Every lord who kept it began by admiring himself, and ended by fearing what looked back." The king said nothing. The priest opened the chest. Inside lay fragments of silver frame, dark velvet, and a piece of blackened glass no larger than a hand. Even broken, it seemed strangely alive, swallowing the lantern light instead of reflecting it. "This is all that remains," Oswin said, "or all that was meant to remain." Aldrin stared at the shard. He could not yet see his face in it, yet already his pulse had begun to pound in his throat. Was it cursed? The priest considered the word. Perhaps, but not in the way peasants speak of curses. It was said that the mirror revealed not beauty, not age, not rank, but the hidden shape of a man's soul once it had been marked by certain deeds. Aldrin's eyes narrowed. And who decided that? Monks? Superstitious old men? "Men who watched kings go mad," Oswin answered, "and who wrote that the most dangerous reflection is the one that does not lie." The king looked again at the black shard. For a moment he thought he saw movement inside it, as if a shadow had passed behind deep water. Then he stepped back. He did not want to touch it. And for the first time, he began to suspect that what haunted him had not awakened in the mirror hall. It had been waiting much longer than that. That night, Aldrin broke his own command. He ordered the servants away, extinguished all but 3 candles, and returned alone to the chamber where a single mirror still remained hidden behind black cloth. He told himself he needed certainty. A king could not wage war against whispers and fragments of priestly warnings. He needed to see the thing plainly, to face it without witnesses, without ceremony, without excuses. Outside, wind dragged across the towers like distant voices. Inside, the room was silent enough for him to hear the wax dripping from the candles. The cloth fell from the mirror with a single pull. At first, the glass showed only what he expected. A man no longer young, though not yet old. Dark hair touched faintly at the temples with winter's first silver. Eyes sharpened by rule, worry, and sleeplessness. He leaned closer, searching for the cruel smile, the movement delayed from his own, the impossible lips in the wine. Then the face in the mirror began to change. The transformation was slow enough to watch, and that made it worse. The skin grew paler, almost gray beneath the candlelight. The eyes sank deeper, ringed with hollow darkness. The mouth thinned. Fine lines became cracks of strain and bitterness. What stared back at him was not a corpse, yet it carried the stillness of something already half separated from life. The crown remained on its head, but now it looked less like a symbol of rule and more like a weight pressing the skull downward into ruin. Aldrin could not move. The reflected king raised one hand and touched the glass from within. Only then did the real king realize he himself had not lifted his own. A sharp breath escaped him. He stumbled backward, striking the table behind him, sending one candle to the floor. Flames spat across the rushes and died. Still, the other version remained there, watching him with terrible calm. And in that pale, ruined face, Aldrin saw something he had not allowed himself to name in years. recognition. Not because it was a stranger imitating him, because some hidden, buried part of him knew exactly what it was seeing. When he tore his eyes away, his whole body shook. But the shaking did not come from fear alone. It came from memory trying to rise. The next day, the court gathered in the great throne room, though none had come willingly. Word of the winter feast had spread too far to ignore, and the northern lords demanded audience before they returned to their lands. They wanted reassurances. They wanted stability. Above all, they wanted to know whether the king who ruled them remained master of himself. So Aldrin, dressed in crimson and sable, set the crown upon his head with rigid precision and entered the hall beneath banners that suddenly felt heavier than stone. The throne room was vast, built to magnify authority. Sunlight from the high windows struck shields mounted along the columns and flashed across polished metal like cold fire. The sight made Aldrin's stomach tighten at once, but he forced himself onward. Petitions were read, oaths were repeated. A dispute over grain levies was brought forward, then a complaint about taxes along the eastern road. The words passed over him like distant rain. He heard them, yet barely. His attention kept drifting to the edges of the hall, where silver fittings, ceremonial armor, and bright helm crests caught the light in brief, merciless glimmers. Then one of the mounted shields turned just enough for him to see it. His reflection, small, distorted, but unmistakable. Only this time it was not still. The image in the shield was looking directly at him, while his real gaze had not yet fully lifted. Its mouth opened slightly, as though already beginning to speak. Not a smile now. Something worse. Intention. Aldrin rose so fast, the nobles nearest the dais fell silent at once. "Take that down," he said. No one moved. The captain of the guard looked up, confused. "That shield," the king snapped, pointing. "Take it down." As two guards hurried to obey, the metal surface shifted again, and for an instant, Aldrin saw the reflected face lengthen into something emptier, sterner, almost triumphant. He seized the ceremonial staff beside the throne and hurled it downward. It struck the shield with a crash that rang through the chamber like a struck bell. Gasps broke across the court. One child of a visiting lord began to cry. A bishop crossed himself. Several nobles stepped back, not from danger, but from the spectacle of royal terror laid bare before all eyes. "Clear the hall," Aldrin said, voice shaking now despite all effort. "Clear it!" This time they obeyed. Within moments the great chamber emptied, leaving only the scattered echo of footsteps and the terrible silence after humiliation. The king remained standing before the throne, chest rising and falling, surrounded by symbols of power that could command armies, taxes and death, but could not command a reflection to behave like a reflection. And somewhere inside that silence, the first shape of madness began to harden into certainty. After the outburst in the throne room, the castle changed. It was no longer merely a place of ceremony, but a place of careful avoidance. By the king's command, basins were emptied before dawn, polished armor was removed from the halls, silver vessels were replaced with carved wood, and every servant was warned to keep reflective surfaces out of sight. Even the fountains in the inner courtyard were covered with dark linen, as though the palace itself had entered mourning. No one laughed openly anymore. When Aldrin passed through the corridors, conversations ended at once. Heads bowed lower than before, but not from respect. It was the bowing of men who feared being noticed. The king saw it in every lowered gaze. He heard it in every silence that followed his steps. Yet all these efforts brought him no peace. He began to sense reflections even where none should exist. In dark window panes at dusk, in rainwater caught between stones, in the glazed eyes of hunting hounds lying by the hearth. Once, while crossing the chapel, he paused because he thought he saw his own face move across the polished brass of a candle stand. But when he turned, there was nothing there except flame and his own ragged breathing. That evening he ordered the castle searched again. Servants opened cabinets, stripped rooms, removed ornaments, and carried away anything that might catch the light. Still, Aldrin remained unsatisfied. He moved through the chambers himself, like a man hunting an intruder no one else could see. By midnight, the palace had been reduced to shadows, cloth, and dull surfaces. And still, somewhere within its silence, the king felt watched. Not from the walls, not from the courtiers, but from something patient, waiting for the next unguarded moment when glass, water, or metal might remember him again. Unable to trust the priest, the court, or even his own senses, Aldrin turned at last to the dead. Beneath the castle, beyond the old wine vaults and sealed storerooms, there lay a narrow chamber where royal records had been stored for generations. It was a place of dust, cracked leather, and forgotten handwriting. The private remains of kings who no longer had voices. One night, carrying a lantern and dismissing even his closest guard, Aldrin descended there alone. He searched for hours among brittle scrolls, burial accounts, letters, private decrees, and journals too dull for any scholar to value. At first he found nothing but routine: wars, taxes, births, negotiations, hunger. But deeper in the shelves, hidden within a damaged chest, he discovered something stranger: the private writings of 3 rulers from his own bloodline, separated by more than a century. Each began differently. One complained of restless sleep, another of shadows in polished silver. A third wrote only scattered lines, almost prayers, about eyes in the glass. As Aldrin read on, the pattern sharpened. All 3 had withdrawn from court. All 3 had ordered mirrors covered. All 3 had begun to fear their own reflection. And each, in the final pages, had written not of demons or sorcery, but of memory, buried memory, a deed, a truth, something done or allowed, something that returned not in dreams, but in the image of the self. The king's hand tightened on the page until the old parchment nearly tore. One line, written in faded ink by a long-dead ancestor, held him longest. The face in the mirror is not false. It is the face that remains when power can no longer protect a man from what he knows. Aldrin closed the journal at once. For a while he sat in the dust and lantern smoke without moving. Then, very slowly, he began to understand that whatever hunted his bloodline had never belonged to the castle. It belonged to the throne. That night, memory came for him more clearly than before. He did not sleep, yet he drifted into something near sleep, a dark, inward place where the castle around him faded and another winter returned. He was younger there, not yet king, only prince, Snow lay across the courtyard stones in thin grey sheets. Torches burned low along the walls. Somewhere far beyond the gates, a bell was ringing. At first the vision showed him little. Boots crossing frost, a hand closing around a cloak, the sound of someone breathing too fast. Then the shapes sharpened. There had been another boy, older than a servant, younger than a knight. A son of a minor noble family brought to court as companion and witness to royal life. Clever, proud, too bold perhaps. Aldrin remembered the argument, though not the first words. He remembered anger. He remembered humiliation. He remembered the other boy knowing something he should not have known. And then, the push. Not planned, not prepared. Only a sudden act born of fury on icy stone. The boy had fallen hard against the edge of the fountain. There had been blood, darker than the snow. A terrible stillness afterward. Aldrin had stared in horror, waiting for movement that never came. He had not meant death, but death had come all the same. The memory should have ended there. Instead, it showed the second crime. Footsteps approached. Someone had seen enough to ask questions. And the prince, son of the reigning king, had done what princes learn too early to do. He had let silence protect him. The death became an accident, then a rumor, then nothing. Aldrin opened his eyes with a cry caught in his throat. The chamber was dark, the fire nearly out. For years he had told himself the past had buried that night. But now, as memory rose fully at last, he understood why the reflection had looked at him, not with hatred, but with recognition. It had been waiting for him to remember the first face he had ever betrayed. The next evening, driven by dread and certainty alike, Aldrin returned to the mirror. He entered alone, barred the doors behind him, and stood in a chamber lit only by 6 candles placed in a half circle around the glass. Their flames wavered restlessly, throwing thin gold over the stone walls. The room smelled of wax, ash, and old cold air. For a long time he simply stared. His reflection stared back. Now that memory had broken open, the face in the mirror no longer seemed merely cruel. It seemed complete, composed, free of the strain that had hollowed the living king. It wore his features as judgment wears a familiar voice. Aldrin lifted one hand. The reflection did not move. A heartbeat later, it smiled. The king's blood turned to ice. Then slowly, deliberately, the figure inside the glass raised its own hand. Not in imitation, but in answer. Its palm met the inner surface. Its lips parted. This time there was no mistake. It was speaking. No sound crossed the glass. Yet Aldrin understood enough from the shape of the mouth to stagger backward. You knew. Not accusation, not surprise. Only truth, quiet and final. The candles snapped in a sudden draft. One went out, then another. The reflection remained visible even in the deepening dark, pale and unnaturally calm, while the real king stood trembling, his breath ragged, one hand pressed hard against his chest, as though the heart inside him had become a wound. He wanted to deny it, to command it silent, to call for priests, guards, fire, anything, but nothing in the room obeyed him. For the first time in all his reign, Aldrin stood not before an enemy, nor a court, nor a rival kingdom. He stood before something that could not be lied to, and that was why he feared it. From that night onward, the king withdrew almost completely from the world. Petitions went unanswered, councils were dismissed, meals were left untouched outside his chamber door. The crown remained for hours at a time upon a carved table beside the hearth, as though even he no longer wished to feel its weight. Servants entered only when summoned, and most were relieved not to be summoned at all. Inside the royal rooms, darkness gathered early. Curtains remained closed through the day. Fires burned low. Covered mirrors stood like mourners in the corners, draped in black. Torn papers littered the floor, pages from old journals, fragments of decrees, and prayers begun but never finished. Aldrin moved among them with the look of a man slowly being emptied. He no longer feared only the reflections. He feared the spaces between them. Sleep brought memory. Waking brought expectation. Every faint glimmer on metal, every drop of water, every polished buckle or candle dish felt like the edge of another encounter waiting to happen. He stopped trusting his eyes, then his thoughts, then the silence itself. When Father Oswin was finally admitted, he found not a king at rest, but a soul in siege. Aldrin sat near the dying fire, unshaven, hollow-eyed, robe hanging loose from a body that seemed to have forgotten hunger. For a while, he did not look up. Then, in a voice almost too low to hear, he asked, "Tell me, Father, if a man sees the truth too late, is it punishment?" Oswin did not answer at once. The old priest looked at the draped mirrors, the abandoned crown, the shaking hand resting on the chair arm. "At times," he said carefully, "it is the beginning of judgment. But sometimes, it is also the last chance for confession." Aldrin closed his eyes. Outside, wind moved along the towers like a whisper passing through the dead. Inside, the king understood that fear alone would no longer save him. Something else was coming now. Not madness, not memory. A reckoning. The following evening, someone entered the king's chamber without waiting for permission. It was Queen Elira. She had endured weeks of silence, whispers, closed doors, and frightened servants. She had watched the court decay into uncertainty and seen fear spread through the castle faster than frost across glass. Unlike the others, she had not come to observe a fallen king, nor to carry rumors away like hidden coins. She came because she remembered the man beneath the crown, or at least the man he had once seemed to be. Aldrin looked up sharply when she crossed the threshold. In the dim light of the fire, she seemed almost unreal herself, dressed in deep blue, her face pale but steady. She held no mirror, no polished tray, no object that might catch the light. Yet near the doorway, unnoticed until her shoe brushed against it, lay a small shard of broken glass from some forgotten ornament. The king recoiled at once. "Do not touch it," he said, voice rough with panic. Elira's gaze dropped to the shard, then rose again to him. She did not step back. "It is only glass." "No," Aldrin whispered. "Not anymore." For a long moment she said nothing. Then she crossed the room slowly and knelt beside his chair, forcing him to meet her eyes rather than the darkness around them. "I do not know what you have seen," she said, "but I know what fear has made of you." The words struck deeper than accusation. Aldrin tried to turn away, but she caught his hand. His fingers were cold, trembling despite all efforts to still them. This close, there was no majesty left in him, only exhaustion, guilt, and the thin edge of a man who had spent too long fleeing something that could walk wherever he walked. Elira, he began, but the name broke in his throat. You must speak, she said softly, to the priest, to God, to me, but not to shadows. At that, his face changed, not with anger, with pain, because he understood then that silence had protected him once, but now it was killing him more surely than any blade ever could. And still, across the chamber, beneath black cloth and dying firelight, the covered mirrors stood waiting. Before dawn, Father Oswin returned. This time, the king did not summon him to the chapel, nor to the hidden vault below. The priest came instead to the chamber itself, where confession could no longer be delayed behind ritual or stone. Queen Elira remained only long enough to place fresh candles by the hearth. Then she withdrew, leaving the two men alone with silence, flame, and the weight of what had not yet been said. Aldrin stood at the window, though he would not look into the dark glass. Frost silvered the edges of the panes. Beyond them, the kingdom still slept under a sky of iron. I remember it now, he said at last. Oswin did not interrupt. The boy in the courtyard, the fall, the blood. Aldrin's hand closed against the stone ledge, and afterward, I let the lie live. Others spoke, others guessed, but I said nothing. I let rank bury truth. The priest lowered his head. Then the face you see is not a curse, he said quietly. It is witness. The king turned, hollow-eyed. Witness to what? A child's rage? A single moment? Oswin met his gaze without flinching. Not only to the push, to all that followed, to the years in which you ruled outwardly with justice, while inwardly guarding the one injustice that shaped you. A hidden sin does not remain still, Majesty. It changes the soul around it. The fire shifted, casting moving shadows against the draped mirrors. Aldrin's mouth tightened. And if I confess now, if I kneel, speak, repent, will it vanish? The old priest was silent for several heartbeats. When he answered, his honesty was almost cruel. I do not know. The words struck like cold iron. But I know this, Oswin continued. Some truths are shown not to destroy a man, but to force him to choose what remains of him, whether he clings to fear or walks into judgment willingly. The king looked toward the nearest covered mirror, not with panic this time, with dread, yes, but also with understanding, because at last the matter stood plain before him. The reflection was not hunting him to drive him mad. It was waiting to see whether a king could do what a frightened prince never had: stand before truth and not turn away. That night, Aldrin ordered the mirror hall opened. No courtier was allowed to follow, no guards, no servants. Even Father Oswin was left outside the great doors, with only prayer and helplessness for company. The king entered alone, carrying neither sword nor crown, only a single lantern that cast a restless circle of light around him as he walked among the towering mirrors. Dust trembled in the air like ash in a ruined chapel. One by one, the mirrors caught him. A pale man in a dark robe, a ruler stripped of ceremony. a soul moving toward the place it had avoided for years. At the far end of the hall stood the tallest mirror, the same ancient glass before which the fear had begun. Aldrin stopped before it and set the lantern down. The flame inside shivered, and the silvered frame seemed to gather the dim light like something breathing. At first, his reflection appeared as before. Then it deepened. The face in the mirror grew calmer than his own, sterner, almost grave. It was no monster, no spirit adorned with claws or hollow eyes. That would have been easier. Instead, it looked like Aldrin freed from all pretense. A man formed entirely of memory, guilt, truth, and the unyielding knowledge of what he had done. Outside, wind struck the tower windows. Somewhere distant, thunder rolled across the winter sky. "You are mine," the king said, though whether he meant the image or the guilt behind it, even he no longer knew. The reflection answered only by lifting its gaze fully to his. And then, impossibly, unmistakably, it took one step forward from within the glass. No crack appeared, no sound broke the air. Yet the figure was closer now, as though depth itself had changed. Aldrin felt the force of it not on his skin, but inside his chest, where fear and truth collided so violently he almost fell to his knees. He wanted to flee. Every instinct in him cried for it. But he remained, trembling, breathing hard, empty-handed. For this was the final shape of terror, not to be pursued, but to stand still while what you have hidden all your life comes near enough to be recognized completely. And in that moment, Aldrin understood that the reflection had never wanted his death. It wanted his surrender. When dawn was still hours away, the sound of shattering glass rang through the western wing. Father Oswin and the guards forced the doors open, but by then, it had already happened. The mirror hall was chaos. Candles had burned down into rivers of wax. The lantern lay overturned. Silver frames hung crooked on the walls, and across the black stone floor glittered countless shards like frozen pieces of moonlight. At the center of the ruin stood Aldrin, breathing hard, both hands wrapped around an iron candelabrum he had used as a weapon. Before him, the ancient mirror was destroyed. Not cracked, destroyed. The great glass had been struck again and again until nothing whole remained. Jagged fragments covered the floor in a wide, shining circle, each piece holding a broken angle of the king's face, the candles, the dark ceiling above. When Father Oswin stepped forward, one shard near his foot flashed with such perfect clarity that he recoiled before he could stop himself. Aldrin did not lower the candelabrum. For a moment, he seemed not to recognize any living man there. Then slowly, as though waking from underwater, he turned toward the priest. Blood ran from a cut across his palm, where glass had opened the flesh. His expression was not victory, it was emptiness. "I broke it," he said. No one answered. "I broke it," he repeated, more softly now, staring at the wreckage as if waiting for something to emerge from it one final time. And still, he did not finish. He did not need to, because all around him, in every shard scattered over the stones, his reflection remained. 100 pieces, 100 silent witnesses. No single face whole enough to command, yet none gone. The guards looked away. Father Oswin closed his eyes. And Aldrin, seeing at last that destruction could not undo recognition, let the iron candelabrum fall from his hands. It struck the floor with a dull, final sound, not like triumph, but like surrender arriving too late. By morning, the throne stood empty. No trumpet announced it. No bell was rung. Yet the truth moved through the castle before the sun had fully climbed the eastern towers. The king was dead. They found him in a small chamber adjoining the mirror hall, seated beside the cold hearth where no fire had been lit. He had not taken his own life by blade or rope. No wound marked him except the blood drying on his hand. He had simply collapsed, as though something within him, stretched too long between denial and truth, had finally given way before dawn. The court would speak carefully of fever, exhaustion, and the burdens of rule. The priests would speak of judgment. The servants would speak in whispers of the face in the glass. Only Father Oswin and Queen Alira knew enough to remain silent. By noon, black cloth hung from the battlements. Nobles gathered in dark robes. The crown, polished and heavy, rested upon a cushion before the altar, waiting for the next head that would bear its weight. Yet even in mourning, the castle did not feel at peace. It felt as though it were listening. In the ruined mirror hall, the broken shards had been swept away, all except one. A single fragment no larger than a hand remained lodged between the cracks of the stone floor, too deep to be easily reached. In it, if one knelt close enough, one could still see part of a face. Not enough to know whether it was sorrowful or stern, only the curve of a mouth touched by the faintest trace of something unreadable. At sunset, Queen Alira stood alone outside the hall. She did not enter. Behind her, the corridors darkened, and the castle settled into the long breath of evening. Before her lay silence, memory, and the knowledge that power can conceal a sin for years, but never erase it. And somewhere in the deepening dark, where stone remembered footsteps and glass remembered faces, the last truth of King Aldrin remained. He had not feared a monster. He had feared the moment his own soul would finally look back at him,